The windmill creaked as it turned slow above the house, its groan carrying across the barren sweep of land. Elias Carver sat on the porch with his pipe, though it had long gone cold, the stem resting against the hollow between his teeth. The sun had fallen low, bleeding red into the horizon, and the fields lay quiet except for the restless hush of the prairie grass. He had grown used to this kind of silence, the kind that weighed on a man until it felt like part of his bones. Since his wife's burial mound had hardened into nothing more than a hillock of dry grass, silence had been the only company left to him. When he heard the sound of horses, it startled him in a way it hadn't for years. Soldiers, 3 of them, rode up through the dust, their bayonets catching the last rim of sunlight. Elias stood, leaning on the rail, his jaw set in a way that suggested both welcome and warning. They didn't stay long enough for either. One of them dismounted and dragged a figure from the back of his horse, a woman, thin and weary, her wrists tied. She stumbled but didn't cry out. The soldier sneered something about her being no use to the fort, spat in the dirt, and shoved her toward Elias's yard as if she were a sack of grain to be left behind. The farmer said nothing. He only looked at her, her dark hair matted, her eyes sharp and unyielding, though rimmed in the weariness of hunger. A scar cut across the skin above her brow, half hidden beneath the strands that fell loose. She stood without asking for pity, her back straight, even with the rope still at her wrists. Elias's throat worked as if to speak, but the words never rose. He had not spoken much in years, not to anyone but the mule and the chickens, and neither had asked him to account for himself. The soldiers mounted again and turned their horses toward the horizon, dust swallowing them until the sound of hooves was gone. The woman did not move closer. She stood near the fence, eyes scanning the land as if she might vanish into it given the chance. Elias gestured toward the house, though he doubted she understood. She shook her head. Her gaze was steady, as if to say she would not step inside a stranger's walls no matter what fate had pressed upon her. That night, the fire in the hearth snapped and hissed while Elias sat in his chair, staring at the coals. The rocking chair across from him, the one his wife once claimed every evening, rocked only when the draft carried through the room. Outside, near the wall of the house, he knew the woman sat against the boards, wrapped in whatever dignity she had left. He had left a plate of cornbread near the door, but when he checked in the morning, it was untouched, the edges gone hard with cold. He didn't want her there. He told himself that as he carried water from the well, as he fixed the broken hinge on the barn door, as he looked at the rope burns on her wrists when she came to the trough to drink. But as the days passed, he found his eyes drifting toward the place she chose to sit, by the wall where the sun touched in the morning and left her in shadow by evening. He saw her watching the fields as he plowed, her expression unreadable, yet her silence mirrored his own in a way that unsettled him. At supper, he left bread and beans on the step again. This time, by dawn, the plate was empty. Still, when he caught her eye the next morning, she looked at him with a defiance that told him she owed him nothing. The prairie stretched vast and unforgiving around them both, a place where the living either bent or broke. Elias had thought himself finished with bending, finished with anything resembling company. Yet now, in the hush between the windmill's groan and the call of the crows, there was another kind of silence, hers, woven into his. He did not ask her name. He did not want to. But he knew already that her being here would not vanish like the soldier's dust. Something had shifted, and though he would not yet name it, he felt the burden of it settle on his shoulders, heavy as the years he had carried alone. The days stretched long, marked only by the shadows that crawled across the fields and the wind that never seemed to rest. Elias moved through his labors with the same worn rhythm he had carried for years, mending a fence rail here, sharpening a blade there, his hands stained with soil and oil. The woman kept her distance, hovering near the barn or the line of trees beyond the well. She spoke nothing, but her silence was not the same as his. Hers carried edges, sharp as flint, as if every word swallowed would have been a wound torn open again. At night he would sit by the hearth, the rocking chair across from him empty as it had been since the day they lowered his wife's body into the ground. He remembered the braid she had cut herself, laid into the grave with her like a promise he was meant to keep. Now that memory pressed against him whenever the fire burned low. He sometimes thought the chair rocked on its own, though it was only the draft crawling beneath the door. Still, it unsettled him, 2 chairs, one occupied, one forever vacant, until the presence outside the wall made him feel the emptiness more sharply than before. She did not come near the firelight. He noticed that quickly. When dusk pressed down and the hearth began to glow, she kept herself beyond its reach, as though the warmth carried pain instead of comfort. Her eyes seemed to look through the flames and into something only she could see, faces perhaps, or the outline of a home lost to smoke and soldiers. The scars she bore were not just the faint marks across her wrists or brow, but in the way she folded into shadow, as if she feared to be illuminated. Elias told himself he did not care. He told himself it was enough that she did not wander, that she would take her fill of water and sometimes bread, and return it with distance intact. Yet, without asking, she began tending the barn. He found the mule brushed, the hens fed, the clutter of tools stacked neatly where before they lay scattered. Her presence began to seep into the corners of his life, as quiet as a draft moving under a door. One morning, he passed her at the well and noticed the way her eyes followed his hands as he carried his old spade. It was the same spade he had used the day he dug the grave, the wood darkened by earth that would never fully wash clean. For a moment, her gaze held his, a flicker of recognition, not of his loss, for she could not know its details, but of the kind of burden that leaves a mark deeper than scars. In the house, symbols of what he had lost lingered like ghosts. A shawl folded neatly in a chest, untouched for years. China plates meant for a table that never saw company again. A half-sewn quilt his wife never finished. Each one spoke to abandonment, not by choice but by the cruelty of time and fate. The Apache woman brought no words to bridge such distance, yet her silence began to echo his own. It was not comfortable, not yet, but it was familiar, 2 solitudes pressed together until they began to resemble something like understanding. One evening he found her in the barn, her hands steady as she tied a rope to mend a broken harness. She looked up only briefly, then bent to her work again, as though the task was her own responsibility and not his. Elias stood there longer than he meant to, the air heavy with the scent of hay and the faint rustle of the animals. He had given her no command, no permission, yet she had claimed the work as if it were the only language she could still speak. He gave her space in the barn after that, an unspoken agreement. A blanket laid across the hayloft, water drawn fresh at dusk. She did not thank him. He did not ask for thanks. But he noticed that she ate more steadily now, and that her eyes had lost a little of the hollow desperation they carried when the soldiers left her. Their silences, once clashing like 2 storms, began to align. The prairie remained wide and merciless, but within its sweep, a fragile rhythm was forming. Elias still returned to the empty rocking chair each night, but now he knew that outside, another soul sat in her own chosen place, carrying her ghosts as he carried his. It was not comfort, not yet, but it was something closer than he had known in years. The storm rolled across the plains with the sound of drums, thunder shaking the ground beneath the house before the rain even came. Elias had known storms all his life, but this one carried a fury that made the shutters rattle and the old roof groan. Wind howled through the cracks, driving dust and water in thin lines across the floor. He was setting a pan beneath the drip from the ceiling when he caught sight of her, darting across the yard in the downpour, her dress plastered against her thin frame. At first he thought she was fleeing, but when he rushed to the door he saw her scrambling up the barn wall, rope in hand, trying to bind the boards against the wind. Lightning split the sky, so close it burned white against his vision, and he shouted, though his voice was swallowed by the storm. She ignored him, clinging to the roof as if defying the storm itself. His boots splashed mud as he ran across the yard, seized her arm, and dragged her down before the sky could claim her. She twisted against him, fierce even in fear, until the thunder crashed so near that they both flinched together. In that instant their eyes locked, hers wide, defiant, yet trembling. His grip loosened, and for the first time, they stood not as strangers but as two souls staring into the same danger. He pulled her into the house. The wind clawed at the door as he shut it, and for a while the storm drowned out everything but its own rage. He stoked the fire, the flames straining against the drafts, and gestured for her to come closer. She lingered at the edge of the room, soaked and shivering. From the shelf he took down a tin of coffee and brewed it strong, the bitter steam filling the air. He set the cup before her. She hesitated as if the offer were a trick, then slowly raised it to her lips. The warmth touched her face, the steam curling like a veil around her, and when she swallowed, her eyes flicked toward him, suspicious still, but softer, almost questioning. They sat in silence as the storm raged. His pipe lay unlit at his knee. Her hands curled around the cup as if the warmth itself were a shield. The fire cracked, casting long shadows across the room, and for the first time since she had come, she did not hide from its light. Morning broke heavy with damp mist. The land glistened in a dull gray, puddles pooling in the wagon ruts. Elias stepped onto the porch, breathing in the scent of wet earth. That was when he saw the rider approaching, weaving in his saddle. A ranch hand he half recognized, a man whose cruelty was known in whispers at the trading post. The stranger reined up hard, sneer already on his face. His words slurred with drink, demanding the Apache squaw he claimed he saw left at Elias's door. He said she belonged to no man, so she belonged to any who would take her. Elias stood without answering at first, his rifle resting against the doorframe. The air between them thickened. The ranch hand spat in the mud, reaching for his stirrup as if to dismount. Elias lifted the rifle, not wildly, not with threat, but with the steady gravity of a man who had buried enough and would bury again if need pressed him. His eyes did not waver. The rider cursed, muttered threats of telling others, of coming back with men who would not ride away so easily. But the muzzle of the rifle did not lower, and after a moment too long, the horse turned beneath him and carried him back into the mist. Elias felt his chest heavy, the weight of something he had not carried in years. Behind him, in the doorway, she stood watching, her eyes no longer defiant but steady, searching his face as if to read whether his choice was true. He had not thought of it until that moment, but it was there, unmistakable. For the first time in years, he had chosen to defend something, someone. The old fire, long buried, had stirred in him again, and though he did not speak it aloud, she seemed to know. She did not thank him. She did not need to. The look in her eyes said enough, he would not give her away, not at any cost. The days blurred, stitched together by work, silence, and the slow crackle of firelight. Yet in the house, under a roof that once knew only his wife's footsteps, tension grew like storm clouds. She began to move through the rooms as though testing their weight, her touch lingering on the pots and pans, the old flour tins, the iron skillet blackened with years of use. One morning, Elias returned from the barn to find her in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, dusting flour across the scarred wooden table. She had found his wife's bread pan, buried in the cupboard, and was kneading dough with careful, deliberate movements. The smell of yeast rose, strange and familiar all at once, as though someone had tugged open a door he had sworn closed forever. Elias said nothing at first, but he watched her. The way her dark hair fell forward as she bent over the dough, the way her hands, calloused, scarred, still worked with a kind of quiet grace. She had never known the woman whose tools she used, yet she handled them as if she sensed the weight of memory that clung to each object. Elias turned away, throat tightening, the sight cutting through him like a plow through fallow earth. Outside the house, the prairie wasn't kind. In town, whispers had started. Men muttered when Elias came in for flour or salt. Carver's keepin' an Apache woman, they said under their breath, though not low enough for him to miss it. The general store clerk, who once spoke civil, counted his change out slow now, eyes narrowed. And on a sharp noon, when Elias drove his wagon back from market, a stone hurled from some boy's hand cracked against the wheel. The wagon jolted, and laughter followed him down the street. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. But his fists tightened on the reins until the leather bit his palms. Back home, the weight of it pressed between them. She saw it in his silence, in the way his jaw stayed set as he chopped wood harder than needful. She, too, grew restless, pacing the edges of the house, gazing toward the horizon as though measuring the miles she might put between them if she had the strength. One evening, after a day of curt words and colder silences, it broke. She told him in her halting English that she would leave, that she wouldn't be the burden that made the town spit at his feet. Her voice trembled with anger, though her chin lifted in defiance. Elias snapped back, his words harsher than he meant, that she'd die out there, alone on the prairie. Wolves, hunger, or worse men than he'd already sent away would finish her. The room grew sharp with their voices clashing, two storms colliding under one roof. And then, in the fire of her anger, she snatched the shawl. The shawl that had lain folded in the cedar chest, the one he had not touched since the day his wife was lowered into the ground. She flung it at him, the faded wool striking his chest with a weight heavier than stone. "You live with her still," she spat, eyes blazing. "Not with me. Not with now." The words sank like an arrow to the marrow. Elias stood, staring at the shawl pooled at his boots, the breath gone from him. He wanted to curse, to shout, but no words came. Only silence, thick and suffocating. She turned from him then, shoulders rigid, her back to him as if she had carved a wall between them higher than any he had built with his own two hands. That night, the house lay heavy with ghosts. Elias sat in his chair long after the fire had burned low, the shawl still lying there, daring him to pick it up. He couldn't. His hand hovered once, then drew back, like a man afraid of fire. At last, he left it where it was and went to bed hollow. Morning brought a different sight. When he came down, the light slanting through the window, he saw her by the hearth. The shawl was no longer on the floor. It was draped over her shoulders, wrapped around her slim frame as though it belonged there. She didn't look at him, not directly. But something in the house had shifted, a choice made not by either of them but by the walls, the fire, the very boards beneath their feet. Elias paused in the doorway, unable to speak, the air thick in his lungs. For the first time in years, the shawl wasn't a shroud of memory but a garment alive again, moving with breath and heartbeat. His wife's shadow lingered, but not as a chain. Somehow, impossibly, the house itself seemed to have chosen to live again, through her. Snow pressed heavy against the windows that winter, muffling the world into a hush Elias had almost grown used to. The farm sat wrapped in white silence, each fence post crowned with snow, each tree bowed under its weight. Inside, the fire cracked low in the hearth, the only voice in a house where words came seldom. He sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, watching her. The woman, he still did not know her name, not in a tongue he could pronounce, knelt near the fire, her hands extended toward the heat. Her dark hair fell loose, a sheen against her worn dress, and he noticed for the first time how steady she was. She moved as if each gesture carried meaning, careful, deliberate, unhurried. "Coffee," he muttered, sliding the spare cup toward her across the table. She looked at it with hesitation, then at him, her eyes sharp, untrusting. But after a long pause, she lifted the mug and sipped. He caught the flicker of surprise when warmth spread through her. She didn't smile, not yet, but something softened in the lines of her face. Later that night, with snow pounding against the roof, he pulled a battered Bible toward him, though he hadn't opened it in years. Instead of reading, he tapped the table. "Chair," he said, pointing. Then he pointed to the fire. "Fire." Her eyes narrowed, suspicious at first, but she mimicked him, lips shaping the words. "Chair. Fire." So began their lessons. By the glow of lamplight, the house filled with the halting sounds of two people trading words, stumbling across the distance between languages. She gave him her own in return, soft syllables, hard consonants that rolled like river stones. He repeated them clumsily, and she shook her head, amused despite herself. For the first time in years, Elias laughed. It startled him, rising rough in his chest, as though his body had forgotten how. She looked at him then, not with fear, not even with guardedness, but with something like disbelief. That night, the house felt less haunted. But peace was never left alone on the prairie. It was near midnight when the dogs barked. Elias stiffened, rifle already in his grip as the pounding came at the door. He opened it to find the ranch hand from weeks past, the one who had called her out by name. His eyes were red with drink, and two other men flanked him, cruel grins shining in the dark. "Evenin', farmer," the man slurred. His gaze shifted past Elias, toward the firelit room where she stood frozen. "We came for what ain't yours to keep." Elias leveled the rifle. "She's not yours to take." Laughter echoed across the porch, harsh against the snow. The ranch hand spat in the drift. "Then we'll cut you down and drag her out ourselves." The first man lunged. The world blurred, rifle stock cracked against a skull, boots thudded against wood, fists and fury tangled in the snow. The firelight spilled through the open door, catching on steel and sweat. Elias took a blow to the ribs, another to the face, but the fire in him burned hotter than pain. For the first time since his wife's death, he fought like a man with something to lose. One man fled clutching a broken nose, another staggered bleeding into the night. The ranch hand cursed, swinging wild, until Elias struck him down into the drift. By the time silence returned, Elias was on one knee, blood darkening the snow at his side. She was at his shoulder in an instant, her hands pressing against the wound, her breath ragged but steady. "No," she whispered, not in his language, but the word carried across both. "No." Through the long hours of night, she tended him with a steadiness he hadn't expected. She stitched with careful hands, cleaned blood with what little cloth they had. Every so often, her gaze lifted to his face, as though willing him to stay. Toward dawn, exhaustion claimed her. He woke to find her asleep in the rocking chair by the hearth, the same chair that had sat empty for so long. Her dark hair spilled across her shoulders, her hands still half extended toward him even in sleep. The fire crackled low, the storm eased, and Elias realized something had shifted. The house no longer belonged to ghosts alone. She was part of it now. Spring came slow, the earth waking under a sky pale with new warmth. The grass pushed through the thaw, tender shoots spreading green across the wide plain. Calves stumbled in the pastures, colts kicked against the morning chill, and the cottonwoods down by the creek loosened their first leaves. Elias leaned against the post of his porch one dawn and watched the land stir back to life. The long winter had not broken him, nor her. They had stood together, through storm and snow, through blood and fear. Now came the harder part, not just survival, but living. Word reached them before long, men in town talking, soldiers riding out from the fort more often, the sheriff himself coming up the wagon road one afternoon. His horse was lathered, dust on its flanks, and his face lined with a discomfort Elias recognized, a man about to speak a truth he did not want to say. The sheriff hitched his reins to the fence and walked up slow, hat in hand. "Elias," he said, not unkindly. His eyes flicked toward the woman splitting wood by the barn. She straightened, axe still in her hands, chin high. "You know how this looks," the sheriff went on. "Folks are restless. Some say it ain't right, you keeping her here. Soldiers are hearing the same." Elias crossed his arms. "She's not a horse, to be kept or traded. She stays because she chooses to. That may be, but others won't see it that way. You're asking for trouble." Elias studied the man, then the horizon beyond him, where storm clouds still brewed despite the brightness of spring. His voice was even when he answered. "Then let it come." That night, as they ate by lamplight, she asked him what the sheriff had said. Her English had grown stronger with the long months, and his ear had grown used to her cadence, the music beneath her words. "He warned me of trouble," Elias told her. "And you?" He set down his fork, looked at her across the table. I told him you stay with me. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand over his, small but steady. Then we stay. A week later, they hitched the wagon and rode into town together. The road stretched wide, dust rising beneath the hooves. She wore the shawl over her shoulders, the one that had once belonged to Elias's wife. Not as disguise, not as claim, but as something remade. The fabric caught the sun, its threads carrying both memory and renewal. When they reached the mercantile, voices hushed. Men leaned against posts, women paused in their talk. Eyes followed every step as Elias tied the team and helped her down. He didn't lower his gaze, and neither did she. They walked inside side by side, and when they laid their coin on the counter, the shopkeeper's hand trembled but took it all the same. On the street outside, murmurs rose like dry grass hissing in the wind. But Elias felt none of the old shame that had once bent his shoulders. The weight of loneliness had been heavier than any stare, and he was done carrying it. When their wagon rattled out of town, sacks of flour and seed tucked in back, she sat beside him, the shawl gathered close. The land opened before them, a sweep of gold and green under the boundless sky. He glanced at her, and she at him, and though no words passed, a truth bound them in silence: they were not farmer and fugitive, not keeper and captive. They were two souls who had chosen each other against all odds. The homestead came into view, smoke curling from its chimney, the fields awaiting seed. Elias felt the stir of something he had long thought gone, the pull of a future. Not the kind he had once dreamed with another woman, long buried, but a future nonetheless. He tightened the reins, the horses leaning into the last stretch of road. At his side, she rested her hand lightly on his arm, a touch that anchored him more than the land itself ever had. Together, they rode home.